All right. So, hello, Maria. I apologize for the delay. I realized that when I sent the initial email, it was too large. So, this is take two and I'm condensing it and I'm uploading it to YouTube. So, this should work. So, fingers crossed. Um, in week 13, we tackled some really fun cases, and some of them are a repeat, an R&R, a recap and repeat of some of the concepts that we tackled at the start of this semester. So, without further ado, week 13 is supposed to be fun because at this stage of the semester, I know everybody's brains are kind of mush. You're tired, you're getting ready to move into this summer mode. So, I designed this week to specifically be fun and give everybody an opportunity to apply some of the concepts to something we all know and love, which is movies, right? Um, so, um, that's for the final exam. And for the final exam for you, just note that I'm a creature of habit. So format wise, it mirrors very much the first and second exam, meaning it has multiple choice, it has true and false. There are about 38 questions. Now, there's not 40 this time. And you may say, why? Well, the last two questions are short answer. So be prepared to assess a hypothetical and consider a concept and discuss it. Now, for those that took the exam, I permitted them to use one sheet of paper, front and back, with notes, double spaced, Times New Roman, size 12, normal font or normal margin, excuse me. So you may do the same, of course. So we tackled cats again in a little more detail. We looked at Miranda, we looked at Terry v. Ohio, we looked at Brady versus Maryland, and I apologize for the typo. So the first part should be familiar to you, which is every man's home is his drumroll. Brrr, castle, right? So we know this concept because, again, we kind of touched on it towards the front part of the semester when we were going over the Bill of Rights and we went over the Fourth Amendment, right? So the Fourth Amendment, it really focuses on government, stay out of my business. Don't touch me. Don't come into my home. Don't come into my business unless you have a justifiable reason. Remember, the founding fathers, they were kind of paranoid. They didn't want the government in their zone, in their private space, unless they had very good reason to do so. And the standard that they're measured by, meaning the government, is by whether or not they have probable cause for purposes right now, right? So to determine whether or not they have probable cause, and so proving that they can search somebody or somebody's property, you should be asking, what is a search? What qualifies as a search? What is unreasonable? Where is that fine line? So everybody has what's called a reasonable expectation of privacy. You, me, everybody. So the example I like to give is, how many times have you ever talked to somebody and they're a close talker, right? Or maybe you're that person. Just kidding. You're not that person. But somebody who gets right up in your face and it's weird. And it's weird because we have an expectation of privacy. We have a personal space. And it's odd when somebody invades that expectation, our personal bubbles, right? So cats is the first time in which the Supreme Court acknowledged the bubble, right? So they acknowledged the bubble in the late 60s. And remember, this time period was not only a time period socially in which there was, Vietnam, women's rights movement, environmental movement, civil rights movement. It was also a movement within the court. So within the Supreme Court itself, they were also enacting massive changes, and the majority of those changes impacted the criminal justice system. So in Katz, you had again Mr. Katz, who again was again kind of a smart dude because he was maintaining a gambling operation nationally from within one phone booth. Again, quite impressive. And the police suspected this, but they didn't know it. They couldn't establish that concept we know and love as probable cause. And without probable cause, they couldn't get a, say it with me, search warrant, right? So they instead followed him to the phone booth, and they established that he went to the same phone booth every day at a specific time. And when he walked away, they scurried over there and they put a device to the outside of the booth that allowed them to record his conversations. And so they just sat back and listened. And they're like, hee 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 hee. And sure enough, they're like, yes, he is. Woo! And they used that information to convict Katz, and Katz was gone, right? So bye-bye, Katz. Welcome to prison. But that wasn't the end of the story, of course. The question was this a search, since they never physically intruded into his space? Of course, Katz didn't live in a phone booth, right? So all the previous case law before this, if you recall, focused on whether officers physically entered into somebody's living space. They had to physically enter a toe, a centimeter into somebody's living space. If they physically entered into the living space, then that qualified as a search, and that triggered the need for a search warrant. So here, if old law applied, then they were fine. They wouldn't need a search warrant. However, this is a new court, right? New sheriff in town. And so there's a huge shift, and that huge shift still applies today, meaning as of 2025, this standard still applies today. So now the test is, does the person have a reasonable expectation of privacy, and is it one society expects? Do they agree with it? If the answer is yes, then guess what? That's a search. You go get that search warrant. If the answer is no, you don't need one, right? So for this scenario, and I think you may have been in class for this one, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but you wouldn't need a search warrant. Why? Because you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy when you're in a restaurant. You're out in the open, you're talking amongst yourselves, but within distance wise, where most people can hear you. So it's not a reasonable expectation of privacy, and that's not one that society would agree with you on. Likewise, with these three cuties who are rocking away on their front porch, if they're yakking, would they have a reasonable expectation of privacy and what they say on their front porch? Tick tock, tick tock. That one's a little trickier. And that brings me to Florida v. Hardeen. This case was extremely interesting because these officers got a tip that this home was being used to grow marijuana. But that's not enough to establish probable cause. And again, without probable cause, you can't get a search warrant. So they didn't stop there. They're like, oh, that's cool. We'll just get, let's make up a name for the dog. What is that dog's name? He looks more like, I was going to say Steven. I don't know why Steven came to mind, but Sarge. We'll call him Sarge. Whereas they were just like, we're going to get Sarge and we're going to go up to the house by the front door. And if he brackets, meaning barks and goes crazy, that'll confirm to us that something illegal is in that house, right? So that's what they did without a search warrant. They brought old Sarge to the front porch, and he did exactly what they thought he would do. He starts barking, going crazy, and they're like, ding, ding, ding. That's our probable cause. So they boogied out away back into their car, got their search warrant, came back, and sure enough, Hardeen's house was filled with marijuana plants. So they're like, woo, we're right? And so they skip back to their car, all happy. So the question there is, should they have had a search warrant when they did that, right? Do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in your front porch, right? What do you think? Well, did the dog sniff constitute a search, thereby needing probable cause? What do you think? So this one is very interesting because the Supreme Court said, yeah, sure you do. And that makes sense, right? So if you've ever had a front porch, wouldn't it be weird if some random person just went on your porch and started looking around your front door? You'd hopefully say, what the heck are you doing? Or call the police, right? Because you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. You don't want people rooting around in that section of your property. Now, just for your information, this won't be on the exam, but that's called curtilage. And you, as a future attorney, you might have heard that term at work, right? but it's called curtilage, and that means the area around your home that is connected to your home and is still protected, meaning cops can't just willy-nilly come into that region without probable cause and a search warrant. So the porch is within that zone and it is indeed protected. So the old lady and the old men on the front porch, they're protected. They can talk about whatever they want without fear of it being eavesdropped on. So what about a frisk though? That's less than a search, right? Because a search, they're putting their hands into the pockets. They're opening the purse and putting their hand in the purse. They're opening the door, walking inside. A stop and frisk is less than that. So they don't need probable cause. Instead, they need what? Reasonable suspicion, which is less than probable cause. Remember, if it's a mountain, up here is probable cause. Down here is reasonable suspicion. So prior to this case that I'm going to talk about, the power to detain and question suspicious persons dates back a long time. And prior to the 1960s, it was the Wild West. But then the Warren Court, again, they latched on to this case in that same era where they were just rendering decision after decision after decision. And again, most of them were extremely progressive to the criminal justice system. But what is noteworthy is they were creating standards, and standards are important because it gives guidelines that apply to everybody, right? Not just some people, but to everybody. And I think that is arguably a good thing. So Terry v. Ohio. Terry v. Ohio is a fascinating case because in this case, you have Officer McFadden. Now, Officer McFadden, he had been watching the same shopping center for decades, right? He had been a police officer within that area for a long time. So he had experience within the region. He had knowledge of how people interacted. He's been there, done that, right? And one day, while he was in plain clothes and he's walking around making sure everybody's minding their P's and Q's, he notices three people. They're walking through up and down the shopping center strip. In the middle of the shopping center was a jewelry store. Okay, I think it was called Zucker's Jewelry. So they're walking back and forth, but they would stop at that jewelry store, look in the window, and then walk to the end of the block, talk, and then walk back, look in the jewelry store, walk this way. But notably, they weren't walking side by side. They were walking staggered in line to where it looked like they weren't together, but they actually were together. Now, I don't know about you, but I usually walk with my friends. Now, there's some friends that I'm like, yeah, I would like you to walk 10 feet away from me. But unfortunately, you have to be right here, right? We all have that one person. So, of course, Officer McFadden would think what was going on or what was about to happen, that they were going to rob it. So all the red flags were adding up, saying that something bad might be ready to happen. Now, policing is usually typically reactive, meaning a crime happens and then somebody calls the cops and then they respond. It's not often that police are able to be proactive, meaning stop a crime before it occurs, right? Until Terry v. Ohio. So once Officer McFadden had all those details in line, he asked the three men to go into the store, he patted them down, and he immediately felt on two of the three men guns, which were not permitted in that area. And so he arrested them, took them in, they were charged, convicted. And the question was, did he have the right to do that? Because up until that point, reasonable suspicion didn't exist and a stop and frisk didn't exist. That standard, that activity, that ability had not been formulated yet until then. So this is the standard. Reasonable suspicion must be supported. And these are the magical words. And Maria, you've got to memorize this, okay? I'm telling you. By articulable facts of ongoing, impending, or past criminal activity. So in other words, the officer can't just say, I had a gut feeling. I had a hunch. That's not good enough. That sucks. They have to be very specific. So here, Officer McFadden could say, I saw them walking up and down the shopping center strip. They walked like they were separate, but they would meet at the end. and talk amongst themselves and then walk back, and they would consistently stop at the jewelry store, look in the window without going in. And they were wearing long black coats, and it was, warmer than usual. So these coats didn't make sense. So those are articulated specific facts that all add up to this. Remember, you can't stop and frisk somebody unless you can establish that you fear that they are armed and dangerous. Remember, it's Texas. A lot of people are armed. You have to also establish that they might be dangerous, right? And that criminal activity, and this is my favorite, is afoot. Again, very Sherlock Holmes-ish. So you need to, as an officer, establish that based on your observations, your knowledge, experience, and training, that you have reasonable suspicion that you can articulate. And a good way to remember that is OKET with the creepy alien, right? And by the way, some of your classmates did not know who this was. After class, many of them said, we didn't know who that was, which shocked me. So observations, knowledge, experience, and training. So we did an activity in class. I'm not sure if you did one or not, in which we practiced various stop and frisk to determine if they were good or bad examples of stop and frisk. If you would like, I can send you the handout, but it's not necessary at this point. But I'm happy to do so. Now, Miranda v. Arizona is an interesting case because nobody's rooting for Miranda in this case. He sucks. He's not a good egg, right? So in this case, a young girl is raped. She gives a very good description to her brother, and her brother says, I know exactly who that is. That's Ernesto Miranda. So they call the police, they confirm that it's him, they pick him up, they put him in a lineup. The young girl identifies him. She says it was him. So they bring him in to interrogate him, and they question him for over 2 hours. Ultimately, he breaks down. He says, I did it. And they have him write his confession, take everything he said, put it in writing. So he signs his confession, and then he verbally confirms his confession, right? And he's sentenced for 30 years. Again, we're not rooting for this guy, right? We're not like, oh, free him, right? Because again, he's not somebody that we're rooting for. However, the question is, at this point, Miranda didn't know that he didn't have to tell them anything. He didn't have to talk. Remember, we have that beautiful Fifth Amendment right, meaning we don't have to help the government prove their case against us. That's their job. We don't have to help them do their job. But he didn't know that. So Chief Justice Warren makes this decision. And I want to point out something interesting about Warren. Most of the time, when chief justices or justices in general make the court, people have these heart attacks and they say, oh, they're going to rule this way and they're going to rule this way. But sometimes they surprise us. Our current Chief Justice Roberts, everybody thought he was going to be a specific way, but surprisingly, he was the deciding vote on Obamacare. And he's made several recent decisions lately that have also surprised folks. So that kind of reflects, in a way, the importance of the impartiality of the judicial branch, meaning they're not elected and they're in there for life. And that's what, the Federalist Papers were indicating, is that these three branches are separate for a reason, in order to balance each other out. In case one branch becomes too big for their britches, this branch says, you need to rein it in a little bit, right? So Warren, he was actually appointed by Republican Eisenhower. He used to be a state prosecutor. He was the governor of California, and he actually ran on the campaign of law and order. So when this case came forward before the Supreme Court, everybody thought he was going to rule in favor of basically the law enforcement, saying that what they did was totally fine, that they did nothing wrong. They were wrong. So instead, Warren and the Supreme Court said, no, this was not okay. Not telling him his rights violates his rights, even though it's not in the Constitution. And also, they indicated that the FBI was already doing this, as well as the military. And for these reasons, and and in addition, being in the spirit of the Constitution, his rights are being violated. Now, what does that sound like? Starts with a P. I hope you're saying it out loud, Maria. Penumbra, right? So that's what they're indicating, that even though this isn't specifically in the Constitution, meaning it doesn't say that law enforcement has to tell us these specific rights when we're not free to leave. It doesn't say that. But taking our rights together, meaning the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, the Sixth Amendment, a right to an attorney and a trial, those indicate that they collaboratively are our rights and should be informed to us in the event we're taken in and not free to leave. So that is an interesting thing with Miranda. So the Fifth Amendment protects you from being a witness against yourself, the Sixth Amendment right to an attorney, and he didn't understand these rights, thus a new trial was needed. Now, as a little lagniappe, a little extra, that's Miranda right there. The decision became law, and it's known as, of course, as the Miranda warning. His conviction was invalidated. Arizona retried him without the confession, and without the confession, he was still convicted. And he was ultimately paroled in 1972. Now, I bring all of that up because his autograph actually became famous. Officers from all over Arizona would take their Miranda card and actually ask Miranda to autograph it, right? They say, please autograph it. And he would. And there's an example. So he got into a bar fight. Boom, 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 boom. Now, the person he got into a bar fight with stabbed him. Boom, boom, shank, shank. And afterwards, guess what? He died. And when the cops came, guess what they read to the person who stabbed Miranda to death? His Miranda rights. All right, I'm going to pause there. I'll be back with video number 2.